The cottage by the sea. The old coastal road wound along the cliffs, weaving through pockets of wild lavender and wind-bent pines. Beyond the bend, where the land dipped toward the ocean, stood a small stone cottage, weathered and soft at the edges, as though time had sanded it smooth. It had whitewashed walls, blue shutters faded by the salt air, and a garden that leaned lazily toward the sunlight. For the first time in years, Clara turned down the narrow lane that led to it. The tires crackled over gravel, and the familiar scent of the sea drifted in through the window, briny and sweet, with a hint of wild thyme. She parked beside the low stone wall and sat for a moment, watching the waves roll in slow, silver layers toward the shore. It had been her grandmother's cottage once, and then her mother's, though neither had lived there full-time in decades. Clara had spent childhood summers here, building sandcastles that melted into the tide and chasing the sea breeze through the fields. Now, after years of rushing from meeting to meeting and hearing the hum of city traffic through her window every night, she had come back with one simple goal: to rest. She unlocked the door. The hinges gave a soft groan, like an old friend stretching awake. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of pine and lavender oil. Dust motes spun lazily in the beams of afternoon light that slipped through the curtains. The air was cool, and the sound of the ocean filtered through the walls, steady and rhythmic. Clara ran her hand along the familiar kitchen counter. Everything was as she remembered. The mismatched mugs, the stack of cookbooks her grandmother had loved, the small bowl of smooth sea stones on the windowsill. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and stood listening to it begin its slow murmur. Outside, a gull cried. A breeze wandered through the open window, carrying with it the faint hum of bees from the garden. The world seemed to have exhaled. When the kettle whistled, she poured herself a cup of tea, chamomile and mint, and stepped outside. The stone path led to a small wooden bench overlooking the cliffs. From there, the ocean stretched endlessly, blue-gray and dappled with sunlight. She sat, sipped her tea, and let the quiet seep in. The first evening passed softly. She unpacked only the essentials: a stack of paperbacks, a notebook, a wool blanket. After dinner, fresh bread, butter, and a handful of olives. She lit a small fire in the hearth. The flames took slowly, flickering gold across the room. She watched them dance and thought about how strange it was, the way peace could feel both unfamiliar and instantly recognizable. When she finally went to bed, the sound of the tide filled the room. Each wave a breath, each pause a promise. She fell asleep before she could finish counting them. The days began to take on their own quiet rhythm. Morning started with a soft blush of sunrise spilling across the sea. The light slipped through the curtains, warm and tender. Clara would stretch, open the windows, and breathe in the salty air. Then she'd make breakfast, usually porridge with honey and berries from the small bush near the garden wall. Afterward, she'd walk down to the beach. The sand was cool in the morning, damp from the retreating tide. Sometimes she collected shells, pale pink and pearlescent, or bits of sea glass that gleamed faintly green. Other times she simply stood barefoot at the edge of the water and let the waves lap at her toes. There was a rhythm to the sea's breathing, a soft give and take that reminded her of music she couldn't quite remember but somehow still knew. One morning, she noticed a fisherman's boat drifting near the horizon. It was small and painted a deep red, the color dulled by years of salt and sun. The man aboard lifted a hand in greeting. She waved back, smiling to herself. There was something reassuring about his quiet presence out there, someone else keeping pace with the day, steady and content. Back at the cottage, she began to tend the garden. It was overgrown, but not in a wild or unruly way, more like it had been gently neglected. The flowers still blooming but leaning toward chaos. She spent an afternoon trimming the rosemary, coaxing the lavender back into shape, and clearing a patch of soil for vegetables. She planted tomatoes, basil, and a few strawberries. The earth was warm beneath her fingers, the smell rich and grounding. When she stood up, her hands were streaked with dirt, but she felt lighter somehow, as if she'd set something right. That night, as the sun sank into the sea, she watched her small garden and imagined the roots beginning their quiet work beneath the soil. On the 5th day, the weather changed. A light mist drifted in from the water, softening the edges of everything. The world became quieter, even the sea subdued beneath its veil. Clara stayed indoors, reading beside the fire. The book was one she'd found on the cottage shelf, its pages yellowed with age. It was a collection of letters, simple reflections on daily life, love, and the rhythm of the seasons. As the rain began to tap gently at the windows, she found herself reading slower, savoring each sentence. Outside, the sea murmured like an old lullaby. Inside, the air was warm, scented with tea and wood smoke. At one point, she glanced up to find a small gray cat sitting on the windowsill outside. Its fur was damp, its eyes bright and curious. Clara opened the door, and the cat stepped in without hesitation, shook itself, and wandered to the hearth as though it had lived there forever. "Well," she said softly, smiling, "I suppose you're home now, too." The cat stretched, purred, and curled up by the fire. From then on, the cat was her quiet companion. It followed her through the garden, napped in sunny corners, and sometimes watched the sea as if waiting for something only it understood. Clara began to talk to it, not expecting answers, but enjoying the rhythm of another heartbeat nearby. She named it Pebble, after the smooth gray stones scattered along the shore. The days drifted by in their gentle procession. She began to paint again, something she hadn't done in years. At first, just simple things. A sprig of lavender, a seashell, the curve of the cliff where the wildflowers met the sea. But soon her brush moved more freely, guided by something softer than thought. She painted the sky's changing moods, the shimmer of sunlight on the tide, the pale light that lingered at dusk. One afternoon, while she painted on the terrace, the fisherman she'd seen before walked up the path. His name was Tomas, he said, and he lived in a small village a few miles north. He carried a basket of fresh mackerel and offered them with a shy smile. "I always bring extra to the folks along the coast," he explained. "Seems a shame to let them go to waste." Clara thanked him and invited him in for tea. They sat by the window, listening to the gulls and the slow hush of waves. Tomas spoke about the tides, how they shifted through the seasons, how the sea always found its way back to balance. When he left, Clara wrapped one of her small paintings, a pale sunrise, over the water and gave it to him as thanks. He looked surprised, then deeply pleased. For a long time after he'd gone, she sat with her cup of tea growing cold in her hands, thinking about how kindness often moved in quiet circles, returning to where it began. Summer deepened. The air grew warmer, the days slower. Every evening, Clara took long walks along the beach. The sky would turn rose and gold, then slip into indigo. The sea reflected it all, like a vast, breathing mirror. She'd walk until the stars began to appear, tiny glimmers in the soft velvet dark. Sometimes she'd think of her life in the city, her apartment high above the traffic, her constant schedule, the endless notifications and demands. It felt distant now, like a story she'd once read and half forgotten. One night, she brought a blanket down to the sand and lay watching the stars. Pebble padded over and settled beside her, purring. The sky seemed impossibly wide, the stars endless. She felt small, but not in a frightening way, more like a single note in a vast, perfect song. The tide whispered close, then slipped away again. The air smelled faintly of salt and night-blooming jasmine. For the first time in as long as she could remember, her mind was still. As the weeks passed, Clara found joy in the smallest things. The creak of the cottage stairs each morning, the way sunlight caught the dust in golden threads, the laughter of children playing down the beach, carried faintly on the wind. One afternoon, while gathering lavender, she found an old seashell wind chime tangled in the rosemary. It was one her grandmother had made, each shell drilled and strung by hand, their edges smoothed by years of weather. She cleaned it carefully, then hung it by the front door. When the breeze came, the shells chimed softly, their song like the sea speaking in a language of calm. Even on days when the fog rolled thick over the cliffs, the sound soothed her. It was a reminder that beauty could exist quietly, without needing to be seen. Tomas visited now and then, sometimes bringing fish, sometimes just conversation. They talked about small things, the patterns of clouds, the best herbs for roasting vegetables, the way the sea seemed different each day, though it was always the same. There was no rush in their words, no need for plans. One late afternoon, as Clara sat painting the garden, a sudden gust carried the scent of rain. She looked up to see clouds rolling in, dark and gentle. She gathered her things and went inside just as the first drops began to fall. The rain came steadily, drumming a soft rhythm on the roof. Pebble leapt onto the windowsill, tail twitching, watching the rivulets race down the glass. Clara lit a candle on the table. Its flame flickered softly, warm against the gray outside. She made soup, carrots, lentils, and thyme, and as it simmered, the whole cottage filled with its comforting aroma. She poured a little into a bowl, sat near the window, and listened. There was something deeply peaceful about a storm when one was safely inside. The world washed itself clean while she sat wrapped in the quiet. After dinner, she wrote in her notebook a few thoughts, a sketch of the sea. Then she curled up under the blanket, Pebble purring against her side, and let the sound of rain carry her to sleep. When the storm passed, the world outside seemed newly awake. The air was sharp and clean, the grass jeweled with dew. Clara stepped outside barefoot, feeling the cool earth beneath her toes. The sea sparkled, sunlight scattered across its surface like glass. In the garden, tiny shoots of green were already pushing through the soil where she'd planted the tomatoes. The sight filled her with quiet satisfaction, a reminder that life, left to itself, always found a way to grow again. She decided to walk into the village that day. The path wound through meadows thick with wildflowers. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, their hum steady and content. The village was small, a cluster of white cottages, a single shop, and a cafe that looked out over the harbor. She ordered tea and a slice of lemon cake and sat by the window, watching the boats drift in and out. People nodded as they passed, some smiling, some pausing to chat. There was a gentleness to the rhythm of the place, as if everyone understood the art of not hurrying. On her way back, she stopped by a small stall, where a woman sold homemade jams. They talked for a while about the weather, the garden, the sea. Clara bought a jar of strawberry jam and walked home feeling light. That evening, she sat by the cliffs and watched the sunset. The sky was streaked with gold and violet, the sea calm as glass. She thought of how far she'd come, not in miles, but in quietness. The cottage, the sea, the simple rhythm of days, they had become a kind of balm. She realized she no longer checked her phone, no longer measured time by anything other than the sun and the tide. Her heart beat slower now, in harmony with the world around her. Pebble rubbed against her leg, purring. She smiled, reaching down to stroke its fur. "I think we've done well here," she whispered. The cat blinked up at her as if in agreement. The next morning, the air was still, not silent. Exactly, there were always the soft sounds of life, the whisper of leaves, the murmur of waves, the distant cry of gulls, but still enough that Clara could hear her own breath blending with the rhythm of the sea. She made tea, wrapped herself in a shawl, and went outside. The horizon glowed pale pink. The world felt poised, suspended between night and day. She sat on the old bench, sipping slowly, and thought about how peace wasn't something to be chased. It was something that arrived quietly when one stopped chasing. As the sun rose, she felt warmth on her face, gentle and new. The sea caught the light, and for a moment, everything shimmered: the cottage, the waves, even the air itself. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the endless rhythm. In, out, in, out. And there, in the hush between breaths, she felt it, that perfect stillness where everything simply was. Weeks passed, though she hardly noticed. The garden flourished, the tomatoes ripened, and the sea glass she'd collected filled a small jar on the mantel. Pebble grew plumper and more affectionate, often curling in her lap while she painted. Sometimes Thomas joined her for supper, bringing stories from the village or tales of the sea. They'd eat outside, the lanterns glowing softly, the waves murmuring below. One evening, he told her, "The tide teaches patience. You can't rush it, can't hold it. You just learn to move with it." She smiled, understanding. "I think I've learned that too." The stars came out, one by one, and they sat in easy silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. By the time autumn began to touch the edges of the world, Clara felt something she hadn't in years: wholeness. She'd come to the cottage to rest, but what she'd found was something gentler, a way of being. When the leaves turned amber and the mornings grew cool, she decided to stay. There was no reason to go back, no clock waiting to claim her. The cottage had become her heartbeat, the sea her lullaby. On the first truly crisp morning, she walked to the cliffs once more. The air was sharp with salt, the waves calm and sure. She breathed deeply, the horizon stretching wide before her. Behind her, the cottage stood quiet and steady, smoke curling from the chimney. Pebbles sat in the window, watching. Clara smiled. The world, it seemed, had no need for hurry. And in that stillness, she found everything she'd ever been chasing: peace, presence, and the simple joy of being alive in the rhythm of gentle days. The sea kept breathing. The garden kept growing. The cottage, wrapped in its soft hum of life, remained quiet, timeless, waiting for each new morning's light to fall across its walls. And each night, when the stars rose and the waves whispered against the shore, Clara would listen, smile, and let the sound carry her gently into sleep. The tide came in, the tide went out, and all was well.